You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 30, The Great Mojave Chase. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Norman Lau.
And I'm Earl Green.
Each week on Gene-ology, we examine specimens of Gene Roddenberry's early TV writing from the archives, looking for signs of the messages that became a mainstay of his later creation, Star Trek.
And sometimes it's been difficult for some of you to follow along with us because we've dealt with scripts instead of shows that were still easily available to the public. But not this time, my friends. We're embarking on Gene's epic run of scripts from one of TV's most beloved Western series, Have Gun, Will Travel, a show that's easy to find on streaming, in cable reruns, and on DVD. So we appreciate your patience and hope more of you can now join us as we ride shotgun with Paladin.
Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, here's Earl Green with this week's trivia.
Thank you, Norman. And welcome, everybody, to Have Gun, Will Travel. A lot of you have been waiting for us to get to this show. A lot of you have been asking when we'll get there. And we're finally here at episode 30 of our podcast. This was only the third episode of Have Gun, aired September 28, 1957, so Gene was leaving his mark on Paladin and his adventures very early on. But then he was invited to. Created by Herb Meadow and Sam Rolfe, Have Gun was originally intended to be a show about a modern-day bounty hunter with a strong code of ethics and justice. And instead of a hotel in San Francisco, Paladin would have operated out of the Big Apple. He would then take a plane to wherever that week's episode happened, and CBS just wasn't interested, unless Herb and Sam turned their show into an odor, a horse opera. The Western was a format that was in ascendancy, and CBS thought Paladin would have potential as an ethical gunslinger. The changes were made, and a pilot episode was filmed between Christmas and New Year's of 1956, while Gene was toiling away on West Point. CBS bought Have Gun and put it on the schedule, and now the show's creators had to find their writers. And Gene was one of a handful of writers invited to a screening of the pilot episode in 1957, precisely because he wasn't steeped in writing westerns. His friend Don Brinkley, also late of West Point, was invited too. Others included Lee Irwin, future writer of Whom Gods Destroy, Ken Kolb, who had written for Medic, a previous series starring Richard Boone, and Jack Laird, a former Highway Patrol and Mr. District Attorney writer, whose later fame would come from butting heads with Rod Serling while they were the two driving creative forces behind Night Gallery in the early 70s. They were all there precisely because the new show's creators wanted a Western with a decidedly modern sensibility. Gene would go on to tie with Harry Julian Fink for the most episodes written for the series. Speaking of Richard Boone, what was the relationship between the star of the show and those who wrote his lines for him? Apparently quite a friendly one. In the Have Gun, Will Travel companion, written by Martin Grams Jr. and Les Rayburn, Boone is quoted as saying, "I'll take Gene Roddenberry, Sam Rolfe, and Harry Julian Fink and stack them against Serling, Chayefsky, Vidal, Rose, Foote, and Shaw any day of the week," name-checking some of the most popular and prominent writers of the day. Very high praise indeed. Now, this is so early in the run of Have Gun, Will Travel that the Ballad of Paladin hasn't even been invented yet. That's not what you hear over the end credits. The end credits for every episode in Have Gun, Will Travel's first year has the same very dramatic piece of Bernard Herrmann music that opened each show. It's only from Season 2 onward that you get Johnny Western singing the Ballad of Paladin as you watch Richard Boone ride off into the distance under the end credits, and we'll tell the story of how that happened when we get there. Let's meet our guest stars. Lawrence Dobkin stars as Billy Joe Kane. Larry Dobkin, as he was known in the industry, was an incredibly prolific actor and director. He appeared in The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Defiant Ones, and Patton, among many other movies. On TV, he appeared in The Adventures of Superman, Dobie Gillis, Space Patrol, I Love Lucy. He was Dutch Schultz in The Untouchables, and he was the narrator in the opening credits of The Naked City after its first season. He was in the very first episode of The Streets of San Francisco and had recurring roles on both L.A. Law and Melrose Place. And he would appear as a treacherous Klingon governor giving a brainwashed Geordi secret instructions in the 1991 Star Trek The Next Generation episode The Mind's Eye. But that wasn't Larry's first visit to the Final Frontier, because he was also a director behind the camera for episodes of Death Valley Days, The Rifleman, 77 Sunset Strip, The Munsters, Gentle Ben, The Mod Squad, Barnaby Jones, and The Waltons. And, rewinding a bit to 1966, he directed an early episode of Gene Roddenberry's new science fiction series, and a pretty memorable one at that. The episode was called Charlie X. We lost Larry Dobkin in 2002. Billy Joe's strongman, Deaver, was played by the legendary Claude Akins. Claude was such a fixture on both the big and small screens that, at best, I can only give you a small sampling of his credits without turning this into the Claude Akins podcast. Claude-ology. Nah. He appeared in multiple episodes each of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Restless Gun, The Rifleman, Tales of Wells Fargo, Wagon Train, The Twilight Zone, Bonanza, Laramie, Rawhide, Laredo, Gunsmoke, and starred in a couple of his own series, starting with Moving On, a show about a mismatched odd couple of long-haul truckers, which aired from 1974 through 76 on NBC. He may be best known for his other starring series role, Sheriff Elroy P. Lobo, who first appeared as a recurring character in BJ and the Bear before spinning off into his own show, The Misadventures of Sheriff Lobo. Now, to give you an idea of how popular Sheriff Lobo was if you weren't there, Claude got to host the Country Music Awards one year that he was playing that role, even though he is not a musician himself. He also spent a pretty good chunk of the 1980s as the guy in the Amco commercials. Sadly, we lost Claude Akins in 1994. The director of this episode deserves a shout-out because the location photography is amazing. Andrew McLaughlin was born in England but grew up on Hollywood soundstages because his father, Victor McLaughlin, was an actor. He naturally gravitated toward showbiz and spent the late 40s and early 50s serving as a production assistant and a second-unit director, taking notes on the techniques of directors he worked with, especially one John Ford. It was Ford who gave him his big break as an assistant director on the 1952 John Wayne movie The Quiet Man, and McLaughlin was closely associated with Western from that moment on. He directed more episodes of Have Gun Will Travel than any other director, 116 episodes in all, and frequently alternated between that show and Gunsmoke, where he was behind the camera for 96 episodes, again, more than any other director who worked on that series. His talents carried him to the big screen, where he would frequently direct John Wayne again in such movies as McClintock, The Hellfighters, Chisholm, Cahill U.S. Marshal, and The Undefeated, and he also found himself working with James Stewart a lot, directing him in Shenandoah, Bandolero, and Fool's Parade. That being said, Andrew also directed the 1975 Joe Don Baker movie Mitchell, a favorite with the Mystery Science Theater 3000 crowd. Returning to the small screen, Andrew directed the pilot episode of The Fantastic Journey in 1977 and the 1982 miniseries The Blue and the Gray. He would collaborate with Gene Roddenberry again during the 1963-64 TV season, directing 4 episodes of The Lieutenant. Andrew McLaughlin, who may well have directed more sheer film footage of the American Western than any other director, died in 2014.
Act 1. At the San Francisco hotel that serves as Paladin's home base, Paladin is kicking back. He's having a good laugh at the expense of a friend of his, an expert horseman from the cavalry who's been having a lot of trouble figuring out how to ride a camel. That's when Paladin happens upon a newspaper article about the Great Mojave Chase. It's an event held by a businessman from Mojave, one Billy Joe Kane, who has a bet that no one can successfully hide from or escape his posse. for 48 hours. In 3 years of the Great Mojave Chase, no one has ever managed to lie low for more than 30 hours without being caught. But to challenge him, you have to take his bet and pay up front. Paladin thinks he knows how a man could beat Billy Joe's bet. You know what a man might need to do that? Hey, do you know where a guy could get a camel? And it's off to the desert town of Mojave on camelback to challenge Billy Joe and his posse. Paladin's cavalry buddy might have a point. Riding on horseback is one thing, but the camel is ungainly. When he rides into town, Paladin is quite a sight. Some of the locals don't even know what kind of animal that is, but Paladin just ties his steed to a post like any other horse and goes to grab a bite to eat. The ticket for that meal is on the pricey side, but not because of the food. It turns out that water runs $1 a gallon in Mojave. And guess who owns the land with all the water in Mojave? Does the name Billy Joe Kane ring a bell? Small world, isn't it? When Paladin asks the restaurateur if anyone has dared to challenge Billy Joe over the exorbitant price tag of water in Mojave, the answer is surprisingly frank. The man isn't afraid Billy Joe will shoot him. Billy Joe doesn't have to. All he has to do is stop selling him water, and he's out of business. And maybe out of luck staying alive. Paladin's seen this sort of thing happen before in a town in New Mexico. He solved that town's problem. Billy Joe's claim to the only watering hole in Mojave might be legal, but it's also immoral. Someone needs to stand up to him. Paladin gives the restaurant owner his card, and nothing more needs to be said. At the Bank of Mojave, Paladin has established a line of credit by proving he's got the money in the bank back in San Francisco, and he withdraws $5,000 in cash, the entry fee for the Great Mojave Chase. The banker warns that for a city mouse like Paladin, that's probably not the wisest of investments. No one has ever beaten Billy Joe at his own game. Act 2. It's about that time that Billy Joe Kane shows up with his hired gun Deaver at his side, curious about, is that a camel? Sure is. Billy Joe offers a cash reward for any information on this camel, or especially its owner. That would be Paladin, who's holding down a table at the restaurant. Remember the owner of the restaurant who was handed one of Paladin's cards? He's done some discreet inquiring, and yes, there are others in Mojave who would like to take Paladin up on his offer, but they just don't want any bloodshed. That's okay. Paladin doesn't really care for that either. He'll take care of the problem for $1,000 to be paid when the rights to Mojave's water are no longer in Billy Joe's hands. And hey, there's Billy Joe and his pistol-packing entourage right now. He heads straight for Paladin's table and pulls up a chair. He's heard all about him and wants to know more about what brings him to Mojave. Paladin upends a bag full of cash. There's the entry fee. Now let's talk odds. And Paladin's taking his bag of cash home if those odds aren't 5-1. Billy Joe offers 4-1, and that's final. Oh, and remember the banker, he's present for all of this, and he opens his mouth a little too wide, letting slip the fact that Billy Joe's only got $10,000 in the bank. If even that. Paladin starts stuffing his money back in the bag, and that's when Billy Joe takes the bait. He'll put his land up as collateral for the bet, but Paladin just doesn't want the land, he wants the water rights put up for the bet as well. Done deal. Although the banker protests that Billy Joe stands to lose it all, the banker returns that evening with $10,000 in cash, the deeds, and a bill of transfer for the water rights. But hey, here's a twist. A local man who heard about Billy Joe paying for information shows up with a book in hand and says he'd better read this. The book is all about animals, and the page he's turned to is specifically about the camel, including its ability to store water and travel incredible distances without stopping for water. Billy Joe decides that Paladin was misrepresenting himself in his bid to win the Great Mojave Chase, and furthermore, decides that Paladin has just forfeited $5,000. Billy Joe's henchman pulls the gun out of Paladin's holster and starts to escort him out. But that's quite all right because Paladin's got a concealed derringer in his belt. He grabs both his money and Billy Joe's as well as those pesky water rights and takes off on his trusty camel, but without a canteen. The Great Mojave Chase, someone unexpectedly, is on, and Billy Joe Kane and his posse are in hot pursuit on horseback. In the open desert and broad daylight, Paladin knows he's in deeper trouble than he bargained for. His camel may have 2 humps full of water, but Paladin has to scrounge for whatever groundwater he can find. And Billy Joe and his posse aren't far behind, and they're quite literally shooting mad. Paladin knows that he can cut a slice off cactus and suck the water out of the inside, and he knows how to lie low. And to Billy Joe's surprise, that's the end of day 1. 24 hours have passed. Under cover of night, Paladin circles around and attacks, stealing a canteen and something bigger than a derringer. And everyone else's canteens? He tips them over. Then he unties and scares off the posse's horses and goes to ground until morning, when it's time to climb back up on the camel. The halftime score, for those of you just joining us, Paladin 1, Billy Joe Kane and his company, zilch. The next day, Paladin finds himself at a watering hole and he camps out there. Little something for him, little something for his camel, and that's when he hears Billy Joe's men on foot not doing too well. They know where his watering hole is, too. Billy Joe demands in the name of decency that Paladin hand over the stolen canteen, which Paladin does, and then he blows a hole through it as one of Billy Joe's men tries to grab it. That means the only water around for miles is right behind Paladin, and he wants to hear Billy Joe beg for some water. Billy Joe admits that he's beaten. He'll sign over the water rights and give up the cash, and he'll start over working the land like he did when he first came to Mojave years ago. Paladin doesn't want the rights signed over to him, but to the town of Mojave. The end.
Excellent job, Norm, as you climb off your camel. I've got to say, I automatically have a huge amount of respect for a Western that in its 3rd week on the air is going to do something as goofy as have its hero ride a camel instead of a horse. Now, it's well known that Richard Boone was not a huge fan of horses. He didn't always get along well with his hooved co-stars, and he is far from the only Western star to not be a big fan of the equine persuasion. He is not alone in that, so it's not as if this makes him, a terrible choice to lead a Western, anything but. But he wasn't a big fan of being on horseback. I wonder what he thought of the camel.
He looked natural at it. And I have a note here that I'm wondering if the person, like there was an old timer that sold him the camel and he kept telling him, you won't have any luck with this beast, we've tried. I'm wondering if that was like the camel handler. Because the camel also looked a lot at ease in that scene.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, no, that's acting, man. Richard Boone, if he was uncomfortable or if he just wasn't clicking right with the camel.
He certainly didn't show it.
He fooled me, that's for sure. He looked like he knew how to ride one all the way back from said character was in the army.
Exactly. The outdoor scenes in this episode are pretty remarkable for late 50s TV. And that has a lot to do with this being just the 3rd episode to hit the air, of course. But there's also a lot of that nebulous thing called production value on the screen. It cannot have been easy or even necessarily comfortable or maybe, dare I say, safe to get those desert shots, but they are really effective. And I'm kind of sad to hear that Ezekiel the Camel is not staying on as a frequent guest star on the show, because as TV steeds go, he's got a lot of personality.
It seems that it could be played for laughs, but because Richard Boone does it so earnestly, that it's such a striking figure seeing a man dressed head to toe in black is riding a camel into town or across the desert. It's such a weird texture, the juxtaposition of those textures, that it can't help but make sense for some reason.
Yeah, I really like that they were willing to do this just 3 episodes in. It's like, okay, so you think this is going to be a tough guy on horseback going around solving people's problems? Well, guess what? There is a fantastic piece of dialogue as the locals in Mojave set eyes on their first camel. I like this one guy. He's like, he's kind of got the head of a moose, ain't he? And a silly expression on his face just like a jackass. Legs like a goat. Say, mister, there's just one question I'd like to ask you. How does a man breed all of them together? And Paladin simply says, Well, it's not easy. They really have to be in love. And he just walks off. He's just perfect deadpan. Perfect deadpan. Another thing you're perhaps not expecting a Western to be is a comedy. And I just thought that was lovely. That may actually be my favorite scene in the whole show.
It's like you're like as dumbstruck as the guy that Paladin just left behind. You're like, okay.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Or Paladin has something in the back of his head that he remembered sometime in his service in the army where he saw something he maybe didn't want to remember. I love the fact that you can watch these on streaming or DVDs, and you can pause them at your leisure just to try and study and kind of absorb like all of what's going on. At the very beginning, we talked about that Paladin comes from, or basically is based out of a hotel, the Carlton Hotel in San Francisco. And the still shot of that opening sequence, you can almost see that the words Carlton Hotel are almost kind of like hand-drawn over kind of like an acetate film that's shot, on top of that plate. So it looks just a little off, but of course you have to put that in there. That's basically saying, my bat cave. I love that Paladin has two sets of attire during the course of this show, most of the shows. He has his gentleman's attire at the Carlton Hotel, which is usually bright, some type of like either like cream or beige or something that shows it bright on screen. And then when he's on the job, quote unquote, he's all black, all black. I don't see a gun on him in the hotel. I think that is untowards being a gentleman walking around, as a sophisticated member of that society. Anything that you liked about that, the Carlton Hotel? We don't really spend a lot of time in it, though.
His shirts are so frilly when he's off duty. Mm-hmm. The joke used to be that only two men alive could wear frilly shirts and steal your lady, and those two men were Prince and John Pertwee. I think we have to add Richard Boone. I think we have to add Paladin to that roster because there's just nothing out of place about it. Of course he's there. Of course he's living that life. Why wouldn't he?
It's his alter ego. So essentially what we're talking about, it's kind of like when Clark Kent puts on his glasses and the suit, or Batman's like, Bruce Wayne's dressed up as a playboy and he's hanging out at the posh, Wayne Manor. This is where Paladin's alter ego, also known as Paladin, hangs out, in the middle of a job. Hey, you know what? $1,000? It affords you the luxury of the Carlton Hotel, right?
Oh, yeah.
$1,000 a job.
Oh, yeah.
I love when Paladin hands the barkeep that's being extorted his calling card, the Paladin, the signature "Have Gun Will Travel" wire Paladin San Francisco printed on the card. It's like when that happens, it's like the A-Team moment, right? When they finally talk to Hannibal. It's like, okay, the episode is on now. It was all fun and games until the card comes out. Now it's business time.
And now I'm hearing the A-Team music. Do you remember that there was actually some confusion among the audience? And I imagine this probably really kicked in reruns. When you had people like me, younger than the show. I at least have my grandmother to explain to me what a wire was. But some people apparently thought Wire Paladin was like Paladin's full name.
Oh, yeah, right. Because, regular phones were a luxury, if that.
Yeah, exactly.
So they'd be doing telegraph wire.
Yeah, exactly. But apparently for some people, and again, I'm kind of speculating that perhaps this came in the age of ubiquitous telephone service. The wire was not a thing. The telegraph was not a thing. And so some people felt that, okay, well, this is this guy's name, Wire Paladin. Why not?
Yeah, it's command rather than a name. But yeah, it's a little... In Superman 1979, Clark Kent, Christopher Reeve, he runs into not a phone booth. He looks at a standing payphone and kind of says, that's not what this is supposed to be. Where am I supposed to change? Right? It's the same kind of thing. It's an era gone by of a certain cultural zeitgeist, if you will. I love the old timer in the beginning of Act 2 when Billy Joe and was it Deaver, not Beaver? They all sound the same. They were looking at the camel, and the old man said, "Hey, I remember what a camel is now. camels were on the way to Bethlehem with the 3 kings. Now, instead of this ugly creature, I think he's kind of holy. I'm like, oh my God.
That changed his mind very quickly.
Yeah. Smart bit of writing with Gene here. So the old man, talking about the holy camel now, he also says that the camels, he's drank 4 gallons of water so far. Now, earlier on, the bartender told Paladin, when Paladin was paying for his exorbitantly expensive meal, that a gallon of water was sold to the town at the cost of $1 a gallon. That means that camel has drank $4 of water, going on his 5th. So that's pretty expensive, to upkeep an animal in town.
Yeah, at that point in history, that's a huge expense.
I don't know if it was a Richard Boone thing or a director thing, a McLaughlin thing, but when Paladin was about to leave and basically say no deal to Billy Joe, did you see how quickly his hand slipped to the side and almost he unsnapped his holster loop off of the hammer?
Yeah, I think that's Paladin for let's not have any trouble here.
Yeah, it was so slick. It was very, very smooth. Interesting line here. So, take Billy Joe Kane's hand now, mister, and we'll have a firm deal. I guess it's a big thing back then, right? A real handshake for a real verbal contract. It was a big deal in
every
the scene,
bit of the paper it's printed on.
Yeah. I also thought it was funny that Billy Joe Kane refers to himself in the third person in that whole scene. It's like, hello, Paladin. Meet Billy Joe Kane. That's me. Shake my hand. Shake Billy Joe Kane's hand. And he's like, okay, we get it. We know your name's Billy Joe Kane. We get it. When Paladin is escaping the saloon with the sacks of money, he pulls a derringer from his belt. I do love a good hidden derringer.
Yeah, that was... We're in episode 3, and I think what we are getting across is this guy has thought of everything. Not everyone else, not every other character in this show has thought of everything, but Paladin has thought of everything because he has seen some stuff.
Mm-hmm. There's some interesting details here. Paladin escapes into the desert. He's part of the chase now, and he doesn't have his canteen, and he's wearing all black in the middle of the Mojave Desert in high noon. I mean, I know he's tough, but he's wearing all black in the Mojave Desert. Paladin tough. That's a whole different level of toughness.
Yeah, and I think Boone is also doing some good work in showing us that this is taking its toll on Paladin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very interesting choice, whether it was a choice from the actor or the director, or both of them working this out together before they rolled film on it. It's very interesting in this Tough Guy Western, Episode 3, Week 3 of this show. We are showing that he is not invulnerable.
But he was digging deep, literally, for water. There's some really interesting things, some choices that were made either by, the director, probably by Gene, where Paladin is sleeping in the shade of the camel's body in his silhouette. I thought that was really smart, just to reduce the amount of heat on him for a few degrees. Cutting through cactus plants and drinking the water out of the meat of the cactus plant. That's smart. That's survival. So you're showing kind of economically that Paladin, he's an expert survivalist. He knows how to survive in these types of situations, even though he'd rather not be there, or he'd rather be at the Carlton Hotel. When Billy Joe's posse comes up on him, he throws him the canteen to show him mercy, and he shoots the canteen full of water, just watches it drain in front of him. That is some cold negotiating right there.
Going back to the survival details a bit, it made me think of how much more gracefully this is executed than the West Point episode about the 2 cadets, one of whom has suffered a snake bite.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was like we're reading you the survival manual in the script. This is much more graceful, and I can't help but think that maybe when Gene watched his West Point episode as it aired, he was like, oh, I'm not going to make that mistake again.
Yeah, it was the same with the one cadet that was flying with an experienced pilot, and the scene before that, one of the pilots passes out because of asphyxiation. There was a complete clinical class on this is what happens if you're asphyxiated, for 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden, hey, look, that happened 2 or 3 minutes later.
It's a structural thing that you can do, and I think we're about to get to another structural thing here, but we're seeing Gene's writing evolving because some of these techniques, some of these tropes, if you will, are coming up again and again, but executed better with each iteration.
You know, there's something that when our audience finally kind of figures it out, there's a certain cadence with the beginning of the episode and the end of the episode. And in this episode, when Paladin says, "So far I've seen you lie, cheat, steal, and try murder. You tried everything but begging. Now get down on your knees, Billy Joe." That's exactly what he said to the camera when he pointed the gun at the camera at the very beginning of the episode. It's like, all right, this is the moment. And he kind of foreshadows that, right, at the very beginning. And I think that's done almost exactly the same way in every episode, right?
It's this episode of Have Gun Will Travel. Remember at the beginning of Space 1999, or actually later Jerry Anderson shows, such as Space Precinct.
Mm-hmm.
You would get this episode, and there was this fast-cutting montage of scenes from the upcoming episode. And then, of course, much more recently, the early 21st century remake of Battlestar Galactica adopted the this episode thing, except that they didn't put this episode on the screen like Jerry Anderson did. But this is kind of a version of that. We're going to take something out of context, something exciting, give it to you up front with no context, and that's going to keep you tuned in because, you know, holy cow, who could he be saying that to? Why would he be saying that? What is happening here? I have to stick around to see how this little morsel I've just been handed fits into the story.
And, you know, the thing is, when we mention comedy in an episode like this, it's not kind of sitcom comedy or slapstick comedy. There's a real wonderful balance of, like, dry humor and obvious humor that's going on. Because at the end of this episode, Paladin's talking to the camel and saying, "Hey, I wish we could be friends," or, you know, "I wish we can continue on together." And then, Earl, you being a big music fan, did you notice that there was a weird kind of version of Camp Down Ladies that was playing out the scene?
I love the camel. I love everything about the camel. As we mentioned, Norm, Herb Meadows and Sam Rolfe created Have Gun Will Travel, and they wanted it to have a much more modern sensibility. They originally devised it as a modern-day show. One gets the impression that perhaps it was always going to be an issue-driven show. And this is where I think Gene's longevity as a writer on this show comes into play, because he had found his tribe. He had found fellow writers and a show created and shepherded by fellow writers that was willing to do what he wanted to do, which was slip the audience a message in the course of telling them a story. And there's quite a message in this episode. Billy Joe's stranglehold on Mojave's water rights is legal, but also immoral. And this is something that should be speaking to us loud and clear in the 21st century. Laws can be changed and reinterpreted and twisted. In World War II Germany, it was legal to round up and exterminate the Jews because the laws had been changed to allow that horrific act. But was it moral? Hell no. In America, it was once legal to own slaves, but was it moral? No. And history has passed its judgment on both of these things and many others. Something may be legal while also being the wrong thing to do, the worst thing to do. Something can be legal and be completely, sometimes staggeringly, inhumane. These people living in Mojave are afraid that Billy Joe's is going to shut off their water. And that doesn't just entail shutting down the watering hole, shutting down the bar or the restaurant. They are not going to have water, and everyone around them is going to be so afraid of what Billy Joe Kane will do to them next. If they cave in and give him water, he can't turn to his neighbors for help. They're that scared. There are plenty of recent events from the news that may well have been legal, but in practice were cruel and unjust. And it's a thing that just runs throughout history. Paladin knows that sometimes you've got to visit that same cruelty on those who are being cruel and see how they handle it. Is he ready to let Billy Joe and his posse die of thirst in the desert sun? I would not bet either $5,000 or a camel against Paladin here. He is in the right, but, whew, like you said, he's being stone cold about it. The entire town is being held hostage for the benefit of one man and his loyal hangers-on, a posse who might not be so loyal once Billy Joe isn't milking quite so much money out of the situation.
Yeah, I want to go back to the scene that I think is a very pivotal scene here in this, like, the middle of the first act. And when the bartender says to Paladin, and Paladin is complaining about, like, I've eaten all around the world, and I have eaten some of the worst things ever, and this was way more expensive than any of that. The bartender's like, hey, look, don't blame me, right? This is the cost of doing business. It's not just the water. It's the water that I clean my kitchen with. It's the water that I boil your food in. It's everything. We're talking like hundreds of gallons of water probably during the course of the business week. And then Paladin says Mojave pays that high privilege for staying alive, and that's just extortion. That's straight up good old fashioned black and white extortion. If I have it and you don't, you're going to pay a premium. There was a news story not too long ago. I think it was during the pandemic, and there was I'm not sure if the manufacturer was like with any of the big pharmaceutical companies, but there was a manufacturer who had, I think it was an EpiPen technology that he was willing to sell for like the most ridiculous, exorbitant amount of money because, one, it was legal because he owned the rights to it, but two, wasn't moral, right? So that's what we're looking at here. Like, he has the means and he owns the product, but what's he doing? What's his legacy that he's leaving behind, right, doing that?
Ask that question to the family of anyone who has died because they didn't have access to insulin.
Yeah.
This story may be from the late 50s, but the problem still exists. And it's just been corporatized now. It's been codified. And from a regulatory standpoint, sure, you can do this, but should you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what I loved about, Paladin and his attitude towards like a Billy Joe Kane out there, because he's a bully. He knows that this guy has recently come into money because of the extortion that he's lorded over, Mojave. And Paladin knows how to deal with bullies, right? And it's nice to see. It's really also ironic to see that you see the black hat actually standing up to the bad guy, because traditionally in Westerns, the black hat's usually the bad guy, which I love. It creates this wonderful moral ambiguity about Paladin, when you first see him. But Paladin says to Kane, "You're a strange mixture, Kane. So far you've gotten what you want without violence, without really breaking the law. But you're being pushed now, and I wonder what that will do to you. I.e., translate that, you're a bully that's pushed people too far, and now somebody is pushing back. Let's see what kind of moral fortitude you have now, since there are no cowards. There's not a coward standing in front of you right now that's afraid of you." This is the thing with extortion, bullies, people that know how to prey on the weaker. What happens when you have somebody that stand up for you? So that's really just a great way and a great example of kind of like Gene's writing here about the honorable thing to do, the right thing to do.
If you think about it, Gene is actually breaking the format of the show on week 3, because this story, unlike so many other episodes of Have Gun, does not begin with Paladin getting the telegram from someone. Right. He gets this camel, he hears about this race, hey, I'm going to check this out. He doesn't hand out the business card until a third of the way through the show. And so this is not a question of there's a problem to be solved and I'm going to go solve it. He's just out having fun with his new buddy Ezekiel, the camel. Who wouldn't want Ezekiel the camel for a friend? But anyway, he's not setting out to solve a problem, but he finds a problem. And once he has the full measure of the cause of the problem, that there is someone lording these water rights over a whole town, he is damn well going to solve it.
I love how he describes the New Mexico job. He's like, I took care of their problem. Ask anyone, right? So he just handles things very, very discreetly, but at the same time with a lot of authority and agency. Towards the end of the episode, when Paladin has persuaded Billy Joe to give up the land rights, I think this is this wonderful scene of testing the handshake clause of one's honor, especially in a Western. Paladin and Billy Joe make amends, and then Paladin gives Billy Joe's gun back. And then, well, he drops it in the sand in front of him, and then it was probably Deaver, probably tries to, he went for it, and Billy Joe stepped on Deaver's hand. Like, he's like, nope, I made a pact.
Not
right?
this time.
I'm a man of honor, as for some reason, was described by the bank manager and some other people in town. He's like, he's not a bad guy. He just kind of like lost his way with the infinite, the money and the power and the income that came with the land rights, the water rights. So I like that Paladin challenges him at the end where he says, without saying, what kind of a man are you now? You could have shot me in the back, but you didn't. You could have taken the land rights or the water rights, but you didn't. So you are that guy, and you just proved it to me. I believed it, but you had to prove it to me. And that's kind of a risk. That's like, all right, this is the old way of doing things.
Again, a very interesting break from TV of the time, where normally your good guy and your bad guy just have to duke it out at the end. There's going to be a fight. That doesn't happen here. Now, Paladin's got him dead to rights, literally. Mm-hmm. But we don't have to see these guys engage in fisticuffs to solve the problem. And that strikes me as very, very Roddenberry.
Yeah. I mean, I did mention that just in briefly, but I love the way that this episode resolves. Paladin gives the gun. Billy Joe doesn't do anything with it. But Paladin also leaves him with the deed, which Billy Joe said he's going to honor. I love that Paladin's his conviction almost shames Billy Joe in a way where he can't act in any other way but honorable. He's like, okay, this guy has just showed me an excellent example, an exemplary example of what it means to be an honorable man. And there's something that harkens back to what we were talking about with Sam Houston when we were covering Destiny and the Raven in Exile, where there's a man whose code of honor is so unwavering and so pure and so rounded in like his whole being that you just kind of like say, I want to be like this guy. This guy has the right idea of it. And I love it in the end when Paladin says to Billy Joe, you're a poor winner, but an excellent loser. And that's kind of like one of those tests of character, saying, you know what? You didn't win today, but you don't have to like it. You don't have to, right? How are you going to live with it? That's kind of like the message, right?
Well, and if you think about it, it kind of goes back to the whole Picard speech about, you can commit no errors and still lose. Well, now, Billy Joe committed a lot of errors over a long period of time. But still, the test of character is when that ride ends, how hard are you going to fight it? How hard are you going to fight to maintain your personal status quo, even if it means everyone else suffers? Or do you come around and say, no, I shouldn't have been doing this. Let's do right by everyone. Let's make amends. At its heart, this story is not just about an economic inequality, but an enforced inequality, an institutionalized inequality, if you will, one that has to be toppled. We have still got lots and lots of those. Until more people start using what they have to help others instead of holding it over the people around them like some kind of fiefdom, we are going to be mired in a world where more people will think they need a Paladin on their side than they need a Picard. I think this is yet another case where Gene Roddenberry, writing in a script in 1957, is speaking to us here and now And in Have Gun Will Travel, he has finally found a venue where he can do so unambiguously. All right, Norman, as we so often do in the Mission Log family of podcasts, we scan every episode we watch for morals, meanings, and messages. Sometimes there aren't. This time, oh yeah, I think there definitely are. What do you think?
Well, Gene kind of lays it out as plain as day when Paladin asks the banker, quote-unquote, is $1 a gallon moral? I mean, we've watched a lot of Gene Roddenberry scripts, 29 in fact, not just the scripts but the episodes, and I don't really remember ever seeing it spelled out so clearly and so specifically when it comes to looking for moral meaning or message in his episodes. I mean, this is about as black and white as it can be. And again, so early in the episode itself where you just try and make sense of, okay, is he formulating this so that the rest of the story can be told with this in the back of people's minds, when it comes to the immorality of Billy Joe. And speaking of Billy Joe, when Billy Joe was called on his honor, right? I love that Paladin has essentially forced Billy Joe to look back at the damage he's done. I mean, yeah, legally, we know that. But again, going back to the quote that Paladin asked the banker, is $1 a gallon moral? Now, yes, Billy Joe obtained the town's water rights in a legal way. And yes, there isn't really anything that he's done in terms of breaking any major laws. He hasn't killed anyone. He hasn't really hurt anyone. He hasn't resorted to violence. It's all about extortion. And that kind of power and wealth through that extortion went probably to Billy's head faster than Billy was even able to handle it. And I think that's what the banker, Mr. Elkins, was telling Paladin, that Billy Joe, he once was an honorable man when he rolled into town, worked the land, did backbreaking work, real kind of like, dirt underneath the fingernails kind of work. And Billy kind of reconciles to that at the end, when Paladin wins the Mojave Desert race and has the water rights transferred back to the town. Billy Joe says he'll go back to working the land, and it's hard backbreaking honest work for honest pay. And I love that there's a lesson here in that, too. There's no shortcuts when it comes to real success. And hard work pays off. I think that's the very meat and potatoes kind of moral meaning or message. I believe that Paladin, when he first stepped foot into town, he sized up Billy Joe Kane fairly quickly. And that's a nice, economic way of basically saying Paladin's not just an expert in human behavior, but he understands the capacity for human greed. He understands that Kane's that kind of immoral person that we want to see justice served to time and again. Billy Joe is the kind of archetype of that overarching oppression. A coward who isn't anything without money or power or muscle behind him. But that's the point, right? Billy Joe isn't that kind of man. That's what greed did to him, and Paladin made him face it. And what I love about what Paladin does and says in this episode, he does so in the most ironclad certainty of his own moral convictions. We've mentioned that there's the possibility of Sam Houston influencing the Paladin character because, like Sam Houston, Paladin is driven by his moral compass, which is unwavering and very specific. He knows what he's capable of within his own moral boundaries and that of the law. Paladin is smart, and he's cunning, and he's educated, and he's an experienced man. And a Billy Joe sees that and reconciles his failures against Paladin's honor and moral compass. And I think maybe it's no wonder why many young men in the target audience of 1957 held Paladin in such high esteem. And we see that if the audience were, in fact, taking the seat of a Billy Joe in this episode and learning from the example that Paladin has set for all these young men. What do you think, Earl?
I think this was Gene finally in his element, and seeing as he found like-minded people in charge of this show, he was finally shielded somewhat from network politics, from producer politics, from the sort of things that would come along that would either water down what he wrote, or worse yet, tell him to be the one to change it. So I think, finally, with Have Gun Will Travel, Gene he's in a safe space to write what he wants. I think what he wanted to write was pretty much this. As long as human nature values making a buck over nurturing a community or over people's lives, this episode's message about taking a stand against institutionalized injustice has no expiration date in sight. Bruce Springsteen once said, "In the end, nobody wins unless everybody wins." And on a purely personal note, I'm really looking forward to the many episodes of this show that were written by Gene Roddenberry. I grew up on reruns of Have Gun Will Travel and Gunsmoke. Anytime I was homesick from school, it was over to my grandmother's house for old westerns, unless they had snakes, and then she would suddenly turn it off and we were watching soaps or game shows or something, because my grandmother was deathly afraid of snakes. And also her world-famous grilled cheese sandwiches, but that's a story for another time. And now I know, and so do you, because you found out about it right alongside me, my childhood sick days were pretty much directed by Andrew V. McLaughlin. But what Gene is putting on the table in front of us is a basic morality tale with some nuance. The nuance is provided by and woven into the characters. And here we are truly seeing him learning the craft that will, I think, you can draw a direct line from this kind of morality tale into what we will be seeing in Star Trek when that show comes around in his history.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows in the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, the Yuma Treasure. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takachi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.